I didn't realize a single photo could hit harder than any insult I'd ever heard. It popped up on my phone the day after the party, a candid someone thought would be funny. And there I was. Or at least a version of me I'd been pretending no one could see. My face looked swollen, my body heavy in a way that felt tired, not just big. And the eyes, God, the eyes. They looked empty, like I'd checked out a long time ago but was still trying to smile so people wouldn't ask questions. I remember staring at that image, feeling this cold shock run through me, like someone had dragged me out of the dark corner I'd been hiding in and forced me under a spotlight. I must have zoomed in 100 times, like maybe I'd find a different angle that made it less painful. But it hurt the same every time. Because suddenly it wasn't just a bad photo. It was a mirror I couldn't dodge. That night, lying in bed, I kept asking myself a question I'd avoided for years. When did I let myself disappear like this? I kept waiting for an answer, some neat explanation. Stress, long hours, heartbreak, whatever. But all I felt was this sinking truth that I didn't know anymore. I didn't know when the weight stopped being physical and started becoming something I carried in every part of my life. And the worst part wasn't the photo. It was realizing how long I'd been living like that without noticing. Looking back now, that moment was only the beginning. I think the part that hurts the most is how quiet the whole thing happened. There was no big moment where my life suddenly changed. It was more like a slow fade. One day I was still myself. Loud, social, the friend who always showed up first. And then little by little I started shrinking, not on the outside but everywhere else. I stopped saying yes to plans. I stopped picking up the phone. I told people I was just tired. But the truth was I didn't want anyone to see how far I'd slipped. Stress didn't just wear me down. It hollowed me out. I'd come home from work, drop my bag, and head straight for the kitchen like it was the only place I had control. Food became the one thing that didn't judge me. Didn't ask questions. It didn't care that I'd stopped recognizing the person in my reflection. I'd promised myself I'd do better tomorrow. But tomorrow always came with the same heaviness in my chest. And the more disconnected I felt from everyone, the more I relied on these little habits that numbed me just enough to get through the day. I started avoiding mirrors not because I hated what I saw, but because looking meant admitting how lost I'd become. Even photos with friends felt like traps. I'd stand in the back, paste on a smile, and pray the picture would come out blurry enough that no one noticed. It was exhausting pretending I was okay when I couldn't even convince myself anymore. There was this one moment, nothing dramatic, when I realized how bad it had gotten. I walked past a group of coworkers laughing in the break room, and instead of joining them like I used to, I kept my head down and hurried back to my desk. Not because I didn't like them but because I felt out of place in my own life. Like I'd somehow become the background character in a story I used to lead. I didn't have the language for it back then. I just knew something in me was slipping, and I didn't know how to grab onto it. And yet, even in that fog, I had no idea what was coming next. Strange how quickly you can get used to disappearing. After a while, it didn't even feel like I was being pushed aside anymore. It felt like I was stepping out of the way before anyone had the chance to notice me. I'd walk into rooms already bracing for some comment or some look, even when no one said a thing. My mind filled in the blanks for them. And the worst part was how believable those thoughts sounded after a long day of pretending I was fine. I stopped making eye contact, mostly because I didn't want to see my own insecurity reflected back at me. I'd catch myself apologizing for the smallest things, holding the door too slowly, taking up space in the elevator, even breathing too loud at my desk. It was like I was convinced my presence was somehow inconvenient for everybody else. That level of shame is quiet, but it eats at you. It makes you second-guess every move until even simple things feel heavy. There was this moment at the grocery store that still sticks with me. I was loading a few things onto the conveyor belt, nothing dramatic, but the woman behind me sighed loudly, clearly impatient. And even though she never said a word, I immediately assumed she was annoyed with me. My speed, my body, my everything. I laughed it off like I always do, made some awkward joke to myself. But inside I could feel that familiar drop in my stomach. Moments like that stacked up, and each one chipped away at whatever confidence I had left. What scared me wasn't that other people were judging me. It was how easily I believed they were right. I'd crawl into bed at night replaying tiny interactions, convinced I'd embarrassed myself in ways no one else probably even noticed. That kind of constant self-doubt doesn't stay in one corner of your life. Spreads, colors everything. And still I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that I'd snap out of it eventually. But deep down I knew something was building. Something I couldn't keep outrunning forever. I just didn't know the moment that would force everything to break open was already on its way. It's funny how the smallest, softest comment can land harder than anything loud or cruel. When my coworker said I looked tired and different, she wasn't being mean. She probably thought she sounded caring. But the way the words settled in my chest felt like someone had finally said out loud what I'd been trying to hide from myself. I laughed it off in the moment, made some joke about needing more coffee, but inside I felt something tighten, like a door I'd been holding shut with my whole body had just cracked open. The rest of that day, I kept replaying her voice in my mind. Not the words but the hesitation. That tiny pause before she said, different. The kind you use when you're trying not to offend someone. It made me wonder what people saw when they looked at me now. Not in a vain way. More in a how long have I been sleepwalking through my life without noticing the damage kind of way. Every meeting, every hallway interaction, I felt hyper-aware of myself in the worst possible way. My posture, my clothes, the heaviness I carried. It all suddenly felt exposed. I went to the restroom at one point just to breathe. I stood there staring at the sink because I couldn't bring myself to look up. I didn't want to see that same dull version of me staring back. So I kept my eyes down, hands gripping the edge of the counter, feeling this mix of shame and frustration rise in me. Not because of her comment but because I knew she wasn't wrong. I was tired. It had changed. And I didn't even know how long I'd been pretending otherwise. On the drive home, I remember catching my reflection in the car window at a red light. Something about the way I looked, shoulders slumped, eyes unfocused, made me feel older than I actually was. Like life had been happening around me, not with me. And for the first time, instead of brushing that feeling away, I let it sink in. It was uncomfortable, almost unbearable, but it was real. It wasn't some dramatic breakdown. It was more like a quiet admission. A whisper in the back of my mind saying, "You can't keep going like this." And even though I didn't have a plan or a clue what to do next, I could feel something shifting inside me. I just didn't realize that this moment, the one that felt so small and so personal, was about to open the door to everything that came after. I didn't have some grand plan that morning. I wasn't trying to reinvent my life or prove anything. I just woke up with this heaviness in my chest and knew I couldn't stay in bed another minute. So I grabbed whatever sweatshirt was closest, stepped outside and started walking. Not fast, not far. Just enough to let my body move while my mind tried to catch up with itself. The air felt colder than I expected, and for a second it shocked me awake in a way I didn't realize I needed. There was something strangely grounding about hearing my own footsteps. Just me and the sidewalk. No expectations. No performance. My head was still a mess. Thoughts bouncing between shame, frustration, and that weird numbness you get when everything feels too big. But there was also this tiny, steady thread running underneath it all. A feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. Something like relief. Or maybe release. I kept waiting for the familiar wave of self-consciousness to hit. The one that usually tells me everyone is watching and judging. But it didn't come. I guess it's hard to worry about being seen when you already feel like you've hit your own breaking point. So I just walked, and the world didn't fall apart. My body didn't collapse. Nothing dramatic happened. But for the first time in months, I felt a little less trapped inside myself. When I got back home, there wasn't some triumphant soundtrack in my head. I was still tired, still hurting, still unsure of what any of this meant. But I remember standing in my kitchen, catching my breath, and realizing I felt lighter. Not in my body, but in the way you feel when you stop holding something in for too long. It was such a small thing. So small I almost dismissed it. But the truth is, that few minutes of fresh air gave me something I didn't know I was missing. It reminded me that I was still in there somewhere, buried under all the noise and fear. And even though I didn't understand it fully yet, something in me had shifted, just a fraction. I just didn't know that tiny shift was about to lead me somewhere I never expected. Didn't hit me all at once. It was more like this slow, steady awareness rising up from the parts of me I'd ignored for too long. After that first walk, I kept catching myself thinking about things I hadn't let myself feel in years. Not the shame or the guilt. Those were always loud. This was quieter, almost unsettling in how honest it felt. I'd be washing dishes or folding laundry and suddenly realize I wanted more for myself. Not more success, not more approval, just more of me. The version of me that used to show up to her own life instead of watching it drift by. There was one night I came home from work and dropped onto the couch, still in my shoes, just exhausted in that bone-deep way that has nothing to do with sleep. Normally I'd distract myself, scroll, snack, zone out. But instead I sat there with this weird mix of heaviness and clarity. I remember thinking, I don't have to keep living like a ghost. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't inspirational, it was just true. And the truth, as uncomfortable as it was, felt like a small kind of relief. I started noticing little things about myself again. The way my chest tightened whenever I felt overlooked. The way I said yes to everyone but never to myself. The way I kept minimizing my own feelings because it was easier than admitting they were real. Those realizations stung, but they also made me feel awake in a way I hadn't felt in years. Like someone had finally turned the dimmer switch up a notch. And honestly, it scared me. Because wanting something different meant I couldn't hide behind excuses anymore. But it also made me curious. Curious about what my life could look like if I stopped checking out of it. That curiosity was tiny, fragile, and a little embarrassing to admit, but it was mine. And holding on to it felt like holding on to a thread back to myself. I didn't know where any of this was going, or if it even mattered. I just knew that something inside me had opened, and for the first time in a long time I didn't immediately shut it down. I had no idea that letting myself feel that tiny spark was about to change everything. Those little changes didn't look like much from the outside. And honestly, if someone else had told me they were working on themselves by swapping soda for water, I probably would have nodded politely and changed the subject. But living it was different. Every tiny shift felt like I was negotiating with a part of me that had been running the show for too long. The cravings, the old habits, the urge to disappear back into autopilot. They were still there, loud and familiar. But now there was also this quieter voice, the one that kept saying, "Try again. Just today." The hardest part wasn't the walking or the earlier bedtimes. It was facing how uncomfortable it felt to choose myself, even in small ways. One night I stood in the kitchen staring at the fridge. Not because I was hungry but because I was overwhelmed. I wasn't used to sitting with my feelings without numbing them. So I grabbed a glass of water, leaned on the counter, and let myself feel messy for a minute. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't motivational. But it was honest. And that honesty made me feel a little stronger than I had the day before. The morning walks became this strange ritual I looked forward to, even on days when my body felt heavy and my mind was fighting every step. I'd catch myself noticing things I'd ignored for years. How the air felt colder near the river. How the same older man jogged past me at exactly the same spot every morning. How my breath didn't burn quite as much after the first week. These small observations were proof that I was actually present, not drifting through another day on autopilot. And slowly, something in me began to shift. I stopped treating my body like an enemy I had to tolerate. I started seeing it as something I could rebuild trust with. It sounds strange, but even drinking water felt like a tiny apology to myself, like saying, "I know I've ignored you for a long time, but I'm trying now." None of it was dramatic. There were no breakthroughs or big emotional victories. Just tiny choices that stacked up quietly, almost shyly. And even though no one around me noticed, I did. For the first time I felt like I was walking toward something instead of running away. But I had no idea how quickly those small steps would lead me into the next turning point. Caught me off guard, honestly. One morning I was brushing my teeth, half asleep, half annoyed at how early it was, when I glanced up and did this double take. My face looked different. Not transformed, not glowing, nothing dramatic like the before and after pictures people post online. Just a little less puffy. a little more awake. My eyes didn't look like they were carrying the whole world anymore. And for a second I just stood there, toothbrush in my mouth, wondering when that shift had happened without me noticing. It wasn't vanity. It was recognition, like seeing an old friend from far away and realizing you actually miss them. I leaned in a little closer, expecting that familiar wave of disappointment to wash over me, the one that usually sends me right back into avoidance mode. But it didn't come. Instead, there was this small, quiet feeling I almost didn't trust: curiosity. For so long, looking in the mirror felt like punishment. It was where I faced everything I didn't want to admit: how tired I was, how checked out I'd become, how much I'd let myself drift. But now, standing there, I felt something shift in the opposite direction. Not pride, not yet. More like possibility. Later that day, I noticed other small things. Climbing the stairs at work didn't leave me as winded. My clothes sat a little differently. Not loose, just less tight in those areas I used to tug at subconsciously. Even my coworkers seemed to look me in the eye a bit longer, maybe because I was finally looking back instead of shrinking away. None of these changes were big enough for anyone to comment on, but they were big enough for me to feel. And that mattered more than I expected. It was strange, realizing my body was responding to the tiny decisions I'd been making, even when my mind felt like it was still catching up. Part of me wanted to downplay it, pretend it was nothing so I wouldn't get my hopes up. Another part of me, one I hadn't listened to in years, wanted to hold on to it, even if it was fragile. That night, I stood in front of the mirror again, just for a moment, just to confirm I hadn't imagined it. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. I just breathed, and it felt like a small victory no one else would ever understand. But looking back, that quiet moment of recognition was only the beginning. I stared at that invitation longer than I should have. It wasn't even a big event, just a small birthday gathering at a friend's place. The kind of thing I used to turn down with some vague excuse about being busy. But this time, when my thumb hovered over the screen, something in me paused. Not out of fear, but out of this strange, unexpected sense of readiness. I wasn't suddenly confident. I wasn't magically comfortable in my skin. I just knew I was tired of living like someone who had to hide from the world. So I typed, "I'll be there," and hit send before I overthought myself out of it. The moment it was done, a wave of nerves washed over me. I stood in my doorway thinking, what did I just sign up for? Old habits tried to creep back in, imagining people judging me, imagining I'd walk in and feel out of place. But there was also this steady feeling underneath the anxiety, something like, "You can handle this." It didn't silence the fear, but it made it manageable. Getting ready that evening felt different. I wasn't searching for an outfit to hide in. I wasn't tugging at my clothes to see how much they revealed. I picked something simple, something that felt like me, not the version I used to be, but the version I was growing into. I caught my reflection before I left, and instead of critiquing every flaw, I just nodded at the woman looking back. Not a compliment, not a celebration, just acknowledgement. And it felt enough. Walking into that house, I expected the familiar tightness in my chest, that instinct to shrink. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt surprisingly grounded. People smiled, said hi, pulled me into conversations. And instead of standing in the corner pretending to text, I let myself be there. Not loudly, not confidently, but fully. I laughed. I listened. I shared a few things. It wasn't a transformation. It was participation. Something I didn't realize I'd missed until I felt it again. At one point, a friend looked at me and said, "It's really good to see you." And the way she said it made me believe she meant more than just the words. It hit me harder than I expected. Because for the first time in a long time I felt like I was actually showing up. Physically, emotionally, all of it. Driving home later, the night still echoed in my mind. Not as a victory, but as proof. Proof that choosing myself didn't have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as saying yes instead of disappearing. But I had no idea that saying yes this one time would open the door to everything that came after. Took me a while to understand what had actually changed. Yes, my body looked different, but that wasn't the part that surprised me. What caught me off guard was the way I carried myself without even thinking about it. I'd catch my reflection in random places, store windows, elevator doors, and instead of bracing for disappointment, I'd just look. Not to judge, not to analyze, just to acknowledge the person standing there. And for someone who spent years avoiding mirrors like they were traps, that felt almost unreal. There was a steadiness in me that hadn't been there before. I noticed it at work when I spoke up in meetings without rehearsing every sentence in my head first. I noticed it when I stopped apologizing for taking up space, even in tiny ways, like walking down a crowded hallway without shrinking my shoulders. These weren't dramatic shifts. They were subtle, almost invisible from the outside. But they felt huge to me. It was like I'd finally stepped back into my own skin after being disconnected from it for too long. One night, I was getting ready for bed and caught myself doing something I hadn't done in years, talking to myself in the mirror. Not in a cheesy affirmations kind of way. More like checking in with an old friend. I remember touching my cheek, feeling the firmness in my arms, noticing how my posture had changed. And instead of thinking, you need to fix this, the first thought that came to me was, you made it through. It was quiet, almost whispered, but it landed in a place I didn't know was still tender. Even the way I treated my own mistakes shifted. When I had a bad day or slipped into old habits, I didn't spiral into self-hate. I didn't label myself as weak or hopeless. I just acknowledged it and moved on. That alone felt like the biggest transformation. Learning to give myself grace instead of punishment. The brightest part, though, was my eyes. I know that sounds cliché, but it's true. There was a light in them again, something alive, something present. I didn't feel like I was fading into the background anymore. I felt like someone who belonged in her own life. Someone worth showing up for. And yet, as grounded as I felt, as proud as I was of the person I'd grown into, I had no idea that one more shift, one I never saw coming, was just around the corner. I still remember the night I finally pulled up that photo again, the same one that had crushed me weeks earlier. I didn't look at it with anger this time, or embarrassment, or that heavy shame that used to sit in my throat. I looked at it like I was looking at someone I used to know. Someone who had been hurting for a long time and didn't know how to say it out loud. And instead of cringing, I felt this surprising wave of softness toward her. Toward me. It was strange, realizing how much compassion I'd given everyone else in my life except the person staring back at me in that picture. She wasn't lazy. She wasn't weak. She was exhausted, lonely, and doing the best she could with the tools she had. For the first time, I didn't see a failure. I saw a woman who survived something quietly, without applause, without anyone noticing. And I felt proud of her in a way I didn't expect. The photo didn't trigger me anymore. Grounded me. It reminded me of the nights I cried myself to sleep feeling invisible. The mornings I couldn't face the mirror. The days I walked around acting like I didn't care when everything inside me was screaming for a lifeline. And somehow, seeing that version of me made the present version feel real, earned, even. Not because of the weight I lost, but because of the weight I stopped carrying alone. I didn't tell anyone about this moment. It didn't need an audience. I just stood there, holding my phone, letting my past and present meet in a way that felt quiet but powerful. Healing isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just the ability to look at an old wound without flinching. Sometimes it's understanding that the person you used to be wasn't the enemy. You just didn't know how to care for her yet. And the truth is, that photo didn't break me. It broke the denial I was living in. It forced me to stop sleepwalking through my life and notice how badly I needed myself. It became the first breadcrumb on a trail I didn't know I was strong enough to follow. I never planned to share this journey. I'm not here to teach anyone how to change. I just know that the moment I thought would ruin me ended up being the one that returned me to myself. Piece by piece, breath by breath. And if I'm being honest, even now, I can't help feeling like this whole story is still unfolding, that the real transformation is only just beginning.